morning when the golden yams of Akachi grew larger than any harvest in living memory, when his neighbor Emeka stood at the edge of his own withering farm and felt something dark and hungry awaken in his chest, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. What started as envy that day would grow into something so poisonous it could destroy not just one man's heart, but an entire village's peace. Emeka didn't know, as he watched Akachi's family celebrate their miraculous abundance, that jealousy was like a seed. Plant it deep enough in bitter soil, and it would grow into thorns that choked out everything good around it. But the ancestors were watching. They always were. And they had plans for both the man who was blessed and the man who could not bear to see another's blessing. In the fertile village of Umueze, where the red earth was so rich it could grow palm trees from scattered nuts, and the rains came exactly when the farmers needed them most, two childhood friends had grown into very different men. Akachi Okafor whistled as he walked through his yam farm in the early morning light, his machete swinging rhythmically as he cleared weeds from around his plants. The yams this season were extraordinary, some as large as a grown man's torso, their vines climbing toward the sky like prayers made manifest. His wife Adaisi sang from their compound nearby, grinding pepper for the morning meal, and their three children's laughter danced on the breeze like music. "Look at this one," he called to his eldest son, Chibuike, pointing to a particularly massive yam. "This beauty could feed a whole family for a week." "Papa, the spirits have truly blessed our farm this year," the boy replied, his eyes wide with wonder at their good fortune. Next door, separated only by a low fence of woven palm fronds, Emeka Okoro bent over his own yam plants with a very different expression. His back ached from the early morning work, sweat dripped into his eyes, making them sting, and no matter how hard he dug around his plants, the yams remained stubbornly small and ordinary. "Why?" he muttered under his breath, his voice bitter as unripe palm wine. "We planted at the same time. We used the same seeds. We worked the same hours. Why do his yams grow like magic while mine struggle to survive?" The sound of Akachi's whistle carried over the fence, cheerful and carefree, and Emeka felt something twist in his stomach, like a snake coiling for a strike. He had known Akachi since they were boys, running naked through the village, catching grasshoppers and sharing stolen palm nuts. They had gone through initiation together, learned farming techniques from the same elders, even married sisters from the same family compound. But somewhere along the way, the gods had chosen to smile on Akachi while turning their faces away from Emeka. "Brother Emeka," Akachi's voice called over the fence, "come see this wonder. The earth has given me a yam so large I cannot lift it alone." Emeka straightened slowly, his knees protesting. Part of him wanted to ignore the invitation, to pretend he hadn't heard. But village customs were strong, and neighbors were expected to share in each other's joys as well as sorrows. He walked to the fence and peered over, then felt his heart sink like a stone thrown into deep water. The yam Akachi was indicating was indeed massive, easily 3 times the size of Emeka's largest. Its skin was smooth and unblemished, its color the rich brown that indicated perfect maturity. "Incredible," Emeka managed, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "I think this might be the largest yam ever grown in Umueze," Akachi said, his voice filled with honest amazement rather than boasting. "The ancestors have been so generous this season. My storage barn will overflow." "Yes," Emeka said quietly, "very generous, to some." If Akachi heard the edge in his friend's voice, he chose not to acknowledge it. "Brother, you must come to our harvest festival next week. Adaise is preparing her famous palm nut soup, and there will be enough food for the entire village. Your family is especially welcome." Emeka felt that snake in his stomach coil tighter. An invitation to celebrate Akachi's abundance, while his own family faced another season of barely adequate harvest. "We'll see," he said. "Much work to do." Of course, but remember, joy shared is joy multiplied, as the elders say." As Akachi returned to his work, humming contentedly, Emeka stood at the fence, watching his neighbor's easy happiness with growing bitterness. Joy shared is joy multiplied. Easy words from someone who had joy to share. What about those who had little to multiply? What about those who worked just as hard, but received less blessing? That evening, as Emeka sat with his wife Ngozi and their 2 children around their modest evening meal of boiled yam and palm oil stew, the contrast between their situation and Akachi's felt as sharp as a machete blade. "Papa," his younger daughter Chinelo said, "why were Chibuike and his family singing so loudly today? Were they having a festival?" "They're celebrating their harvest," Ngozi explained gently. "Akachi's yams have grown exceptionally well this season." "Better than ours?" asked Kelechi, his older son. Emeka felt his jaw clench. "Much better than ours." "But why, Papa? Don't we work just as hard as Uncle Akachi?" The innocent question hit Emeka like a physical blow. His children called Akachi uncle, because the 2 families had been close since before the children were born. They played together, shared tools, helped each other during planting and harvest seasons. Or at least, they used to. "Some people," Emeka said carefully, "are just luckier than others." Ngozi shot him a warning look. She knew her husband well enough to recognize the dangerous note creeping into his voice. "The earth gives what it gives," she said firmly. "Our harvest may be smaller, but it's still enough to feed our family. We should be grateful for what we have." "Grateful," Emeka repeated. "Yes, grateful for less while watching others receive more." "Emeka," Ngozi's voice carried a note of concern, "what is eating at your heart? This bitterness is not like you." But Emeka couldn't explain the dark feelings that had been growing in his chest like thorns. How could he tell his wife that every night he lay awake wondering why the gods seemed to favor his neighbor? How could he admit that Akachi's success felt like a judgment on his own worth, as a farmer, as a provider, as a man? Instead, he stood abruptly. "I need air," he muttered, and walked out into the compound. The night was clear, with stars scattered across the sky like scattered cowrie shells. From Akachi's compound next door came the sounds of family contentment, children's sleepy chatter, Adaizi's gentle lullaby, Akachi's low rumble as he told stories by the fire. Emeka stood in his own quieter compound and felt the contrast like a weight on his shoulders. His children were fed and healthy. His wife loved him. His harvest would sustain them through the season. By any reasonable measure, he was blessed. But reason had little power against the green-eyed demon that had taken residence in his heart. All he could see was what he lacked compared to Akachi. All he could feel was the unfairness of watching someone else prosper while he merely survived. What Emeka didn't know, as he stood there nurturing his grievances under the starlit sky, was that envy was like a small fire. Feed it with enough bitter thoughts, and it would grow large enough to burn down everything he truly valued. The ancestors, watching from their place between the worlds, shook their heads sadly. They had seen this story before, played out in countless villages across countless generations. They knew how it would unfold if no one intervened. But they also knew that sometimes the deepest lessons came from the darkest experiences, and that healing was often impossible without first exposing the wound. Over the following days, Emeka found himself unable to stop watching Akachi's farm. Every morning, as he tended his own modest plants, his eyes were drawn irresistibly to the abundant growth next door. Each magnificent yam seemed to mock his own smaller harvest. Each song from Akachi's compound felt like salt in a wound that wouldn't heal. The village market day arrived, and Emeka watched as Akachi loaded basket after basket of premium yams onto his cart. The largest specimens drew crowds of admirers, and merchants competed to offer the best prices. "Brother Akachi," called Mama Ngozi, the palm oil trader, "those yams are like works of art. My customers in the big city will pay top price for such beauties." "The ancestors have been generous," Akachi replied. But Emeka noticed he didn't seem uncomfortable with the attention. In fact, he seemed to be enjoying the praise, the admiration, the way people gathered around his cart like he was some sort of farming hero. When Emeka arrived with his own cart of smaller, ordinary yams, the contrast was stark. A few regular customers bought what they needed, but there were no crowds, no excited comments, no competitive bidding. His yams were adequate, serviceable, forgettable. "Ah, Emeka," said Papa Obinna, one of the village elders, "your yams look healthy this season. Good solid food for hard-working families." The words were meant kindly, but Emeka heard the difference. Akachi's yams were called works of art and beauties. His were called adequate and solid. Even the compliments felt like reminders of his second-place status. At the Palm Wine Bar that evening, where the men gathered to discuss the day's business and share stories, Akachi was the center of attention. "Tell us your secret, brother," urged Chidi the blacksmith. "What magic did you use to grow such magnificent yams?" Akachi laughed and shook his head. "No magic, my friends. Just the same techniques our fathers taught us. Proper spacing, adequate weeding, prayers to the ancestors for good weather." "But surely there's something special," pressed Papa Emeka. "Yams like yours don't grow from ordinary farming." "Perhaps the ancestors simply smiled on my farm this year," Akachi said modestly. "Next year, the blessing might fall elsewhere." Emeka sat in the corner, nursing his palm wine and feeling each word like a thorn. The blessing might fall elsewhere, as if divine favor was just randomly distributed, as if Akachi's success was pure luck rather than evidence that the gods valued him more highly. "What do you think, Emeka?" Chidi called over. "You've known Akachi longest. Has he always been such a master farmer?" All eyes turned to Emeka, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. They were asking him to praise his neighbor, to join in the celebration of Akachi's triumph, while his own efforts went unnoticed. "Akachi has always been fortunate," he said carefully. The word choice was deliberate, and Akachi's smile faltered slightly. Fortunate implied luck rather than skill, chance rather than effort. "Fortune favors the hardworking," Papa Obinna said diplomatically. "Both you boys learned farming from the best teachers in the village." "Yes," Emeka said, his voice gaining a bitter edge. "Some of us just seem to be better listeners, I suppose." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The implication was clear. Akachi's success wasn't just luck, but evidence of superior virtue, while Emeka's smaller harvest suggested some failing on his part. Akachi set down his palm wine and leaned forward. "Brother Emeka, if you'd like to discuss farming techniques, I'm always happy to share what I know. Perhaps we could walk through both our farms together, compare methods." The offer was genuine, born from years of friendship and a sincere desire to help. But to Emeka, it felt like condescension. The successful man offering to teach the failure how to do better. "I think I know how to farm my own land," Emeka replied coldly. "Of course, I didn't mean to suggest. I just thought—" Akachi trailed off, clearly confused by his friend's hostility. The other men shifted uncomfortably. Village harmony depended on neighbors supporting each other, especially those who had grown up together. This tension between childhood friends threatened the social fabric they all depended on. "Perhaps it's time I headed home," Emeka said, standing abruptly. "Early morning tomorrow, more adequate work to do." He left without the usual round of farewells, walking home through the darkened village, with anger burning in his chest like swallowed fire. Behind him, he could hear the resumed conversation, probably discussing his strange behavior, his obvious jealousy, his inability to be happy for a friend's success. By the time he reached his compound, the anger had transformed into something darker and more dangerous. As he lay on his sleeping mat beside his wife, listening to Akachi's family settling in for the night next door, Emeka began to plan. If the gods wouldn't bless his farm equally, perhaps there were other ways to level the field. If divine favor was truly random, as Akachi claimed, then maybe it was time to test that theory. The ancestors, still watching, felt a chill run through the spirit realm. They recognized the signs of a good heart turning toward darkness. But they also knew that some souls had to walk through shadow before they could truly appreciate the light. What worried them was how much damage might be done to innocent people along the way. Emeka's opportunity came sooner than he had dared hope. 3 days after the uncomfortable scene at the Palm Wine Bar, Akachi approached him with a request that seemed sent by fate itself. "Brother Emeka," Akachi said, leaning over the fence between their compounds, "I need to travel to my wife's family village for 3 days. Her mother is ill, and Adaeze needs help with the preparations for the funeral rites, if the worst happens." Emeka felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear about her mother's illness. Thank you. I was wondering, could you keep an eye on my farm while I'm gone? The yam season is so critical right now, and there are rumors of wild pigs coming down from the hills. If they get into the farm..." The irony was perfect. Akachi, in his trusting friendship, was asking the very person who envied him most to protect his prosperity. "Of course," Emeka said, fighting to keep eagerness out of his voice. "What are neighbors for?" "I knew I could count on you," Akachi said with relief. "The yams just need to be checked for pest damage, and if you could repair any breaks in the fence, I'll make sure to bring back palm wine from Adaeze's village to thank you properly." That evening, Emeka watched as Akachi's family loaded their traveling baskets and set off down the path toward the main road. Adaeze waved goodbye over her shoulder, and their children called out promises to bring back presents for their Uncle Emeka's family. As soon as they were out of sight, Emeka felt a strange transformation come over him. The reasonable part of his mind, the part that remembered friendship and duty and proper behavior, seemed to step aside, making room for something darker. He waited until full darkness, then slipped into Akachi's farm. The magnificent yams lay in their beds like sleeping giants, their vines rustling softly in the night breeze. Moonlight painted everything silver, making the farm look magical, ethereal, like something from a spirit story. For a moment, standing among his neighbor's abundant harvest, Emeka felt the full weight of what he was considering. These weren't just yams. They were Akachi's livelihood, his family's security, the fruit of months of careful labor. But then he thought of the market day, of the crowds around Akachi's cart while his own went unnoticed. He thought of the Palm Wine Bar, of being asked to praise the very success that highlighted his own inadequacy. He thought of his children asking why they couldn't have abundance like their playmates next door. The darkness in his heart whispered seductive justifications. Akachi already had more than enough. A few missing yams wouldn't hurt him. It was just evening the scales, correcting an unfair imbalance. The gods helped those who helped themselves. Emeka began to dig. He selected carefully, not the largest yams that would be immediately missed, but medium-sized ones that might be explained away as poor growth or animal damage. He took enough to make a difference, but not enough to create obvious evidence of theft. By dawn, he had transferred a significant portion of Akachi's harvest to his own storage barn, carefully covering the theft by rearranging the remaining yams and damaging some vines to suggest wild pig intrusion. When Akachi returned 3 days later, Emeka was waiting with a perfectly prepared story. "Brother, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with false regret. "Wild pigs came through on the second night. I chased them off as quickly as I could, but they did some damage to the northeast corner of your farm." Akachi hurried to survey the damage, and Emeka followed, feeling his heart pound as his friend examined the carefully staged scene. "It could have been worse," Akachi said finally, though his voice carried disappointment. "Thank you for driving them off. Without you here, they might have destroyed everything." The gratitude in Akachi's voice was like a knife in Emeka's chest. His friend was thanking him for protecting the very property he had stolen from. "I did what any neighbor would do," Emeka managed. "Not any neighbor," Akachi replied warmly. "A true friend. Someone I can trust completely." That night, alone in his storage barn, counting the stolen yams, Emeka should have felt satisfaction. Instead, he felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of his chest and left to rot. But the next market day, when he arrived with a cart that was fuller than usual, when merchants commented on his improved crop, when other farmers looked at his yams with something approaching respect, the hollowness began to fill with something that felt almost like pride. "Your harvest seems much better this week, Emeka," observed Mama Ngozi. "Yes," he said, surprised by how easily the lie came. "I discovered some yams I had missed in my initial harvest. Sometimes the best ones hide underground longer than expected." The merchant who bought his premium yams, the ones that should have been Akachi's, paid top prices and promised to recommend him to customers in the big city. Walking home with more money in his pocket than he had seen in years, Emeka began to rationalize his actions. Maybe this was simply the god's way of correcting an imbalance. Maybe Akachi had been blessed long enough, and now it was someone else's turn. Maybe theft wasn't theft when it was really just redistribution. But late that night, lying on his sleeping mat beside his peacefully sleeping wife, Emeka heard something that made his blood turn cold. From next door came the sound of Akachi quietly crying. The sound was soft, muffled, but unmistakable. The broken sobs of a man trying not to wake his family while grieving a loss too painful to bear alone. For the first time since beginning his dark plan, Emeka understood the true cost of his actions. Those weren't just yams he had stolen. They were hope, security, a father's ability to provide for his children. Akachi was crying not just for lost yams, but for lost faith in himself, in the ancestors, in the fundamental fairness of existence. And Emeka was the author of that loss. But by morning, when the sound of his neighbor's grief had faded and the memory of market day success returned, Emeka's conscience had once again been overpowered by the darker voice that whispered, "You deserve this. You've earned this. Take what you need to survive." The ancestors watched this transformation with deep sadness. They had seen good men corrupted by envy before, had witnessed how jealousy could turn friends into enemies, neighbors into predators. But they also knew that every fall contained the possibility of rising again, that sometimes a person had to lose themselves completely before they could find their true nature. The question was whether Emeka would find his way back before destroying everything he actually valued in pursuit of what he merely coveted. The theft became easier the second time. 2 weeks later, when Akachi and his family attended a wedding in a distant village, Emeka struck again. This time, he took more. Not just yams, but also some of Akachi's prized cassava and even a few bunches of plantains that were nearly ripe. He had learned to be more sophisticated in his deception. Instead of staging obvious animal damage, he created more subtle signs of crop failure, carefully introduced pests, selective root damage that would cause gradual withering, strategic removal of stakes that would make vines collapse and die. To anyone observing casually, it would look like Akachi's miraculous growing season was simply coming to a natural end, his supernatural luck finally running out. But the cost of each theft was higher than just the stolen crops. Each act of betrayal required more lies, more elaborate deceptions, more careful management of evidence and alibis. Worse, each success made the next theft feel more justified, more necessary, more like simple survival in an unfair world. When Akachi confided his growing worries about his failing crops, Emeka offered sympathy with a straight face. "I don't understand it," Akachi said one evening, as they sat together mending farming tools. "Everything was growing so perfectly, and now, it's like the earth itself has turned against me." "Sometimes that happens," Emeka replied, working oil into a machete handle with studied concentration. "The ancestors give, and the ancestors take away." "But why? I've made all the proper offerings, followed all the traditions our fathers taught us. My family needs this harvest." The pain in Akachi's voice was raw, honest, devastating. Emeka felt it like a physical wound, but pushed the feeling aside. Akachi still had more than most farmers. This was just evening the balance. "Perhaps," Emeka said carefully, "the gods are testing your humility. Maybe the early abundance made you proud." It was a cruel suggestion, and Emeka saw it hit its target as Akachi flinched. "I tried not to be boastful," Akachi said quietly. "I thanked the ancestors every day. I shared with neighbors, gave generously to those in need." "Of course," Emeka said quickly, recognizing he had pushed too far. "I didn't mean to suggest. I'm sure the bad fortune will pass soon." But the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, Emeka heard Akachi praying loudly in his compound, begging the ancestors to forgive any pride or ingratitude that might have caused his crops to fail. The sound should have brought Emeka satisfaction. His rival humbled, his own position improved. Instead, it filled him with a sick mixture of triumph and self-loathing that sat in his stomach like spoiled food. The real crisis came when Akachi's youngest child, little Adana, fell ill with the wasting sickness that sometimes struck children during the dry season. The local healer prescribed expensive herbs that could only be purchased from traders in the big market 2 days' journey away. "I'll have to sell more yams," Akachi told his wife, loud enough for Emeka to overhear from his side of the fence. "Maybe some of the seed yams I was saving for next season." "But if you sell the seed yams, what will we plant next year?" Adaisy's voice was tight with worry. "What choice do we have? Our daughter needs medicine now." Emeka stood frozen in his compound, a basket of stolen cassava in his hands. Akachi was being forced to sacrifice next year's crop to pay for medicine for his sick child. Medicine he could easily afford if Emeka hadn't been systematically stealing his harvest. For a moment, the weight of what he had done crashed over him like a collapsed roof. This wasn't just about competition between farmers anymore. This was about a child's life, a family's survival, the destruction of people he had once loved, like his own blood relatives. He could return the stolen crops. He could confess. He could find some way to help with the medical expenses without revealing his guilt. But as he stood there wrestling with his conscience, he heard his own daughter Chinelo coughing in their sleeping hut. The same dry cough that had preceded Adana's illness. The stolen crops in his hands represented security for his own family, insurance against the possibility that he might soon face the same impossible choice between future planting and immediate medical needs. The dark voice in his heart whispered its familiar justifications. Akachi's family wasn't his responsibility. Everyone had to look out for their own children first. Survival was more important than friendship. Instead of returning the cassava to Akachi's barn, Emeka carried it to his own. But that night, for the first time since the thefts began, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw little Adana's fever-bright face, heard Akachi's desperate prayers, felt the weight of betrayal settling on his chest like a stone. When morning came, Emeka learned that Akachi had indeed sold his seed yams to pay for the medicine. The transaction had been witnessed by half the village. A proud man reduced to sacrificing his future for his child's present, all while his closest neighbor and oldest friend watched in apparent sympathy. "I'll help you find replacement seeds when the time comes," Emeka had offered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Thank you, brother," Akachi had replied, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know what I'd do without friends like you." That afternoon, Emeka sat in his storage barn, surrounded by the fruits of his betrayal, yams and cassava and plantains that rightfully belonged to the family next door. The abundance he had dreamed of was finally his, but instead of satisfaction, all he felt was a gnawing emptiness that no amount of stolen crops could fill. He had become the thing he had always despised, a man who profited from another's suffering, who betrayed trust for personal gain, who valued possessions more than relationships. But he had gone too far to turn back now. Confession would mean disgrace, exile, possibly prison. His own family would suffer for his crimes. The only path forward was to continue the deception, to live with the guilt, to hope that time would dull the sharp edges of conscience. What Emeka didn't realize was that guilt, like stolen goods, had a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it was hidden. And in a village where everyone watched everyone else, secrets had a tendency to surface when least expected. The ancestors, observing this tragic transformation, prepared to intervene. They had watched long enough, seen enough damage done to innocent hearts. It was time for truth to emerge from the shadows, no matter how painful that emergence might be. Sometimes they knew destruction had to be complete before healing could begin. The truth began to unravel, as truth always does, through the innocent observations of children. Kelechi, Emeka's older son, had developed the habit of playing with Chibuike, Akachi's eldest, in the narrow space between their family compounds. The boys had grown up together, shared toys and stories, and the kind of casual intimacy that made the fence between their homes feel more like a doorway than a boundary. It was Kelechi who noticed that the yams in his father's storage barn looked remarkably similar to the ones that had disappeared from Uncle Akachi's farm. "Papa," he said one evening as the family shared their evening meal, "why do our yams look exactly like the special ones Uncle Akachi was growing? The ones with the funny curved shape and the reddish skin." Emeka felt his heart stop. "What do you mean?" "Chibuike showed me the place where his family's best yams were growing, and then wild pigs ate them. But our storage barn has yams that look just the same. Did we grow the same kind?" The innocent question hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Ngozi looked up from her food, her eyes moving between her son and her husband with growing suspicion. "Different farms can grow similar yams," Emeka said carefully, "especially when the seeds come from the same source." But the explanation sounded weak even to his own ears. The yams Kelechi was describing were a rare variety that Akachi had been developing for years, carefully selecting and replanting the best specimens to create a unique strain. The chances of Emeka growing identical yams naturally were essentially impossible. Kelechi said, accepting his father's explanation with the trusting nature of childhood. But Ngozi's expression remained thoughtful, troubled. The second crack in Emeka's deception came from an unexpected source: his own success. At the next market day, Mama Ngozi, the palm oil trader, made a comment that sent cold fear racing through Emeka's veins. "These yams of yours, Emeka," she said, examining his latest offering. "They're remarkably similar to the ones Akachi was selling earlier in the season. Same size, same quality, same unusual coloring. It's almost like they came from the same farm." "Good soil, good techniques," Emeka replied, but his voice sounded strained. "Indeed. It's just interesting that your harvest has improved so dramatically at the same time that Akachi's has declined so mysteriously. Almost like the gods decided to transfer his blessing to you." The comment was made casually, without obvious suspicion, but Emeka caught the sharp intelligence in the trader's eyes. Mama Ngozi had been buying and selling produce for 30 years. She knew the difference between natural variation and something more suspicious. Word began to spread through the village, not as direct accusation, but as quiet speculation. People began to notice the coincidences, the timing of crop failures and improvements, the similarity of produce, the strange pattern of misfortune that seemed to follow Akachi wherever he went. Chief Okonkwo, the village leader whose wisdom was matched only by his fairness, called Emeka aside after the next market day. "Brother Emeka," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "some people in the village have been asking questions about the unusual changes in crop fortunes this season." "Questions?" Emeka's mouth felt dry as dust. "Nothing direct, you understand. But farmers talk, and when patterns emerge that don't match natural cycles." The chief studied Emeka's face carefully. "I've known you since you were a boy, Emeka. You're not a dishonest man by nature. But these have been difficult times, and difficult times can make people consider difficult choices." The opportunity to confess was right there, offered with kindness and understanding. Emeka could see in the chief's eyes that honesty now might lead to mercy, that the community might find ways to heal the damage without destroying the relationships involved. But instead of speaking truth, Emeka chose the path of deeper deception. "I don't know what people are suggesting," he said stiffly, "but my harvest comes from my own land, my own labor, my own relationship with the ancestors." Chief Okonkwo nodded slowly, but disappointment flickered across his features. "Of course, I had to ask, you understand. For the peace of the village, I understand." "Good. Then I'm sure you won't mind if a few of the elders examine both farms in detail, just to put the rumors to rest. Examine them how? Oh, just a careful review of soil conditions, planting patterns, storage methods, perhaps some divination to determine if supernatural forces are at work. You know how seriously we take matters that might involve the displeasure of the ancestors. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. If divine investigation revealed theft, the punishment would be severe, not just for the crime itself, but for the spiritual pollution it brought to the community. Of course, Emeka said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever you think is necessary. That night, Emeka sat in his compound, staring at the stolen abundance that surrounded him. In a few days, the village elders would conduct their investigation. The diviner would cast his shells, or read his palm nuts, and the truth would emerge, as it always did when the ancestors were called upon to judge between truth and lies. He could run, take his family, and flee to a distant village where no one knew their history. But that would mean abandoning everything they had built, leaving behind not just property, but the entire web of relationships that gave life meaning. He could confess, throw himself on the mercy of the community, and hope that years of friendship and generally good behavior might earn him a second chance. But confession meant public humiliation, possible exile, certainly the loss of respect that was more precious than any material possession. Or he could continue the deception, hope somehow to outwit investigation, pray that the ancestors might overlook one man's desperate attempts to level an unfair playing field. As he wrestled with these impossible choices, a sound drifted over the fence from Akachi's compound. Soft sobbing that spoke of despair, too deep for public expression. The sound struck Emeka like a physical blow. He realized with sudden terrible clarity that his actions had done more than steal crops. They had stolen his friend's confidence, his sense of divine favor, his trust in the natural order that governed farming and family and life itself. Akachi was crying not just for lost yams, but for lost faith in himself, in the ancestors, in the fundamental fairness of existence. And Emeka was the author of that loss. For the first time since the thefts began, Emeka saw himself clearly, not as a victim of unfair circumstances, but as the creator of suffering in the life of someone who had never wished him anything but good. The ancestors, feeling this moment of recognition, stirred in the spirit realm. The hardest part of any healing was acknowledging the wound. Emeka had finally reached the point where pretense was no longer possible, where the pain he had caused could no longer be hidden behind justification and rationalization. But acknowledgement was only the beginning. The real test would come in what he chose to do with this terrible knowledge. Dawn came gray and heavy, with clouds that promised rain, but withheld their blessing. Emeka stood in his compound, watching the light slowly reveal the familiar landscape of his life. The fence that separated his property from Akachi's, the storage barn filled with stolen abundance, the house where his family slept peacefully, unaware that their security was built on betrayal. In a few hours, the village elders would arrive to begin their investigation. The diviner would cast his sacred shells, and the ancestors would speak through the patterns they formed. There would be nowhere to hide from their judgment. But as Emeka stood there in the growing light, he realized that the ancestors' judgment was less frightening than his own. For the first time in months, he was seeing himself clearly, not through the distorting lens of envy and justification, but with the brutal honesty that comes when all pretense is stripped away. He was a thief, a betrayer of friendship, a man who had stolen not just crops, but peace of mind from someone who had never done him harm. The knowledge sat in his chest like a swallowed stone, heavy and indigestible. From next door came the sounds of Akachi's family beginning their day. Children's voices raised in morning chatter, a Daisy humming as she prepared breakfast, the scrape of tools being gathered for another day of increasingly desperate work. Emeka closed his eyes and made his choice. He found Akachi in his diminished farm, examining the yellowing vines that had once promised abundance. His friend looked older than his years, worn down by the mysterious failures that had plagued his crops and the constant worry about providing for his family. "Brother Akachi," Emeka said, his voice hoarse with sleepless nights. Akachi looked up, and his face brightened with genuine warmth despite his troubles. "Emeka, good morning. I was just trying to understand why these vines keep dying. Perhaps you could look with fresh eyes." "No," Emeka interrupted. "I need to tell you something that will change everything between us." Something in his tone made Akachi straighten, his expression shifting from welcome to concern. "What is it, brother?" Emeka took a deep breath that felt like swallowing fire. "The wild pigs didn't destroy your crops." "What do you mean?" "I mean there were no wild pigs, no mysterious plant diseases, no curse from the ancestors." Emeka's voice was barely above a whisper, but each word fell like a stone into still water. "I stole from you, again and again. I took your yams, your cassava, your plantains. I created the damage to hide the theft. Everything that's been happening to your farm. It was me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Akachi's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning understanding, and finally, a pain so deep it was almost physical to witness. "You," he said finally. "You've been... But why? We're friends. We're like brothers. If you needed help, why didn't you just ask?" The simple question broke something inside Emeka's chest. Because of course Akachi would have helped. Of course he would have shared his abundance freely, gladly, without judgment or condition. That's who he was, who he had always been. "Because I was jealous," Emeka admitted, the words scraping his throat raw. "Because I couldn't stand watching you succeed while I struggled. Because I convinced myself that your blessing was somehow my deprivation, that the only way for me to rise was for you to fall." Akachi stared at him as if he was speaking a foreign language. But I would have given you anything you needed. You know that. You know I would never let your family suffer while mine prospered." "I know." Emeka's voice cracked. "I know that, and I did it anyway. I chose envy over friendship. I chose theft over trust. I chose to destroy something beautiful because I couldn't bear not being the one who possessed it." They stood facing each other across the damaged farm. Two men who had grown up together, learned life's lessons side by side, shared the deepest bonds that existed between neighbors and friends. And now, because of choices that could never be unmade, that relationship lay in ruins. "Where are my crops now?" Akachi asked quietly. "In my storage barn. Most of them. I sold some at market, but the rest, they're still there." Akachi nodded slowly, as if trying to process information that defied understanding. "And the medicine money? For Adana?" "The crops I sold. Yes, some of that money came from your yams. So my daughter's life was saved by crops stolen from her own family." The irony was too bitter for either man to fully absorb. Emeka's theft had created the crisis that necessitated selling seed yams, but it had also provided the resources that ultimately paid for the medicine that saved Adana's life. "I'm sorry," Emeka said, though the words felt utterly inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Akachi. I know it means nothing now, but I never meant for it to go so far. I never meant to hurt your family." "But you did hurt us." Akachi's voice was still quiet, but it carried a weight of pain that made Emeka flinch. "You hurt us every day, systematically, deliberately. You watched my children worry about whether we would have enough food. You listened to my wife cry at night. You heard me pray to the ancestors, begging them to explain what I had done wrong to deserve such punishment." Each word was true, and each truth was a knife blade. Emeka had not just stolen crops. He had stolen peace, security, faith in divine justice. He had poisoned his friend's relationship with the very ancestors whose blessing had made life meaningful. "What happens now?" Emeka asked. Akachi was quiet for a long moment. staring at the damaged vines that represented the visible evidence of invisible betrayal. "Now," he said finally, "the elders arrive to investigate mysterious crop failures, and they will find—" "What will they find, Emeka?" It was a question with layers of meaning. Would they find evidence of theft carefully preserved? Would they find a repentant thief prepared to accept consequences? Or would they find two neighbors who had somehow found a way to heal the wound between them? "They'll find the truth," Emeka said, "whatever you want that truth to be." "What I want," Akachi said slowly, "is to understand how the person I trusted most in the world could choose to destroy me rather than simply talk to me about his struggles. I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense." "Try." So Emeka tried. He spoke about the corrosive nature of comparison, about how seeing another's success had slowly poisoned his ability to appreciate his own blessings. He talked about the way envy had grown in his heart like a cancer, feeding on itself until it consumed everything healthy around it. He admitted to the sleepless nights spent justifying theft as redistribution, to the careful rationalization that had allowed him to see himself as victim rather than perpetrator, to the gradual hardening of his heart against the very people he claimed to love. "It started with just one stolen yam," he said. "I told myself it was temporary, that I would pay it back somehow. But each theft made the next one easier. Each lie required more lies to support it, until I was living in a completely false world where I was the hero of my own story, and you were somehow the villain for having what I wanted." Akachi listened without interruption, his face reflecting the complex emotions of someone trying to reconcile the person he had known all his life with the actions that had been revealed. When Emeka finished speaking, they stood in silence while the morning sun climbed higher and the sounds of village life continued around them. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that two friends were trying to decide whether their relationship could survive the weight of deliberate betrayal. "The elders will be here soon," Akachi said finally. "Yes. And you're prepared to confess, publicly, to accept whatever punishment the village decides?" "Yes." Emeka's voice was steady now, no longer shaking with fear or shame. The decision to tell the truth had brought a strange kind of peace, the relief that comes with finally setting down a burden too heavy to carry alone. "Even though it means disgrace, possible exile, the loss of everything you stole to gain." "Especially because of that," Emeka replied. "I can't keep what I gained through betrayal. I can't build my family's security on the foundation of yours family's suffering. I can't live with myself knowing that every meal we eat, every moment of prosperity we enjoy, was purchased with your pain." Akachi studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to see past the surface words to the heart beneath. "And if I were to forgive you?" he asked quietly. "If I were to tell the elders that we resolved the matter privately, that restitution has been made and justice served?" Emeka felt his knees go weak with the magnitude of grace being offered. After everything he had done, after all the deliberate harm he had caused, Akachi was still thinking about mercy rather than revenge. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said honestly. "Perhaps not. But my children deserve to grow up in a village where redemption is possible, where people can change, where mistakes, even terrible mistakes, don't have to define someone forever. Your children deserve to grow up in a village where theft is punished, where betrayal has consequences, where actions matter more than intentions." "They deserve both," Akachi said. "Justice and mercy, accountability and forgiveness. The question is whether we can give them both." The sound of approaching voices indicated that the elders were arriving for their investigation. Soon this conversation would become public, and private choices would become community judgment. "What do you want me to do?" Emeka asked. Akachi looked at him one last time, really looked at him, as if trying to see the boy he had grown up with beneath the man who had betrayed him. "I want you to be honest," he said finally. "Not just today, but every day from now on. I want you to return what you stole, accept responsibility for what you did, and then spend the rest of your life proving that this was not who you really are." "And in return?" In return, I will remember that the man who hurt me is also the man who chose to tell the truth when lies would have been easier. I will remember that friendship is not just about good times, but about whether people can find their way back to each other after the worst times. As the village elders approached, carrying the tools of investigation and divine consultation, Emeka and Akachi stood together, facing the consequences of choices that could never be undone. But they stood together, which was perhaps the most important thing of all. The healing would take time. Trust, once broken, would have to be rebuilt grain by grain, day by day, through consistent action rather than mere words. But healing was possible, and sometimes that possibility was enough to begin the long journey back toward wholeness. The ancestors, watching from their place between worlds, nodded in approval. They had seen this story play out countless times, across countless generations, and they knew that the most beautiful part was not the avoiding of mistakes, but the courage to face them honestly, and the grace to help others do the same. In the village of Umueze, where the red earth was rich enough to grow friendship as well as crops, two men prepared to show their community what redemption looked like in practice. 2 seasons later, when the rains came exactly when they were needed, and the earth blessed both farms with abundant growth, Emeka and Akachi worked side by side preparing for the harvest festival. The village had decided, after much deliberation and consultation with the ancestors, that Emeka's punishment would be restorative rather than purely punitive. He had returned all stolen goods, paid restitution for what had been sold, and committed to 3 years of community service during planting and harvest seasons. More importantly, he had stood before the entire village and told the complete truth about his actions, holding nothing back, accepting full responsibility without excuses or justifications. "I let envy poison my heart," he had said that day, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered community. "I chose to see my neighbor's blessing as my deprivation. I stole not just crops, but peace of mind. I betrayed not just friendship, but the trust that holds our community together." The punishment had been significant: loss of status, public humiliation, the burden of proving himself worthy of continued membership in the village, but it had also included the possibility of redemption, the chance to rebuild what had been broken. Now, as they loaded carts with yams that belonged to their rightful owners, the two men who had nearly destroyed their friendship were learning how to be neighbors again. "Your yams look particularly fine this season," Akachi commented, examining Emeka's honest harvest. "Thank you. Your advice about soil preparation made all the difference. And your help with the weeding saved my crops during the dry spell. I couldn't have managed alone." It was awkward still, this careful rebuilding of relationship. There were moments when old hurts surfaced, times when trust wavered, occasions when the weight of history threatened to crush new growth. But there were also moments of grace, when Akachi's children ran to Uncle Emeka with the same enthusiasm they had always shown, when Emeka's family was invited to share meals without hesitation, when two men who had known each other since childhood remembered why they had valued each other's friendship in the first place. At the harvest festival, when the village gathered to celebrate another season of abundance, Chief Okonkwo stood to address the community. "We gather not just to celebrate the earth's blessing," he said, "but to remember the lessons this season has taught us. We have seen how envy can poison the heart, how deception can damage the soul, how betrayal can tear apart the fabric that holds us together." His eyes found Emeka in the crowd, and his expression was grave, but not unkind. "But we have also seen how truth can heal what lies have wounded, how forgiveness can restore what anger has broken, how community can support redemption when individuals choose to change." The feast that followed was abundant and joyful, filled with the laughter of children and the satisfaction of adults who had worked hard and been blessed with good results. But the most beautiful moment came when little Kelechi, Emeka's son, stood up to make an announcement. "I want to thank Uncle Akachi," the boy said, his voice clear and confident, "for teaching my father how to be a better farmer and a better man." The silence that followed was profound, broken only when Akachi stood and embraced the child who had unwittingly helped reveal the truth that led to healing. "Your father taught himself," Akachi said gently. "I just reminded him of what he already knew, that friendship is more valuable than any harvest, and that truth is the only foundation worth building on." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, and families began to gather their children for the walk home, Emeka found himself standing once again by the fence that separated his compound from Akachi's. But now the fence felt different. Not like a barrier between competing farms, but like a connection between allied households, a reminder that good neighbors could remain individuals while still supporting each other. "Brother Emeka," Akachi called softly from his side of the fence. "Thank you for this season's work. Your help made all the difference." "Thank you for giving me the chance to help," Emeka replied, "for trusting me again when I hadn't yet earned it." "Trust isn't just earned," Akachi said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's chosen. Sometimes you decide to trust someone not because they've proven they deserve it, but because you want to give them the chance to prove it." As they stood there in the peaceful evening air, surrounded by the evidence of honest labor and shared abundance, both men reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. For Emeka, it had been a journey from envy to acceptance, from deception to honesty, from isolation to community. He had learned that comparing his life to others was a poison that corrupted every blessing he received, and that the only cure was gratitude for his own portion, combined with genuine joy in others' success. For Akachi, it had been a journey from naive trust to wise forgiveness, from confusion about divine justice to understanding of human complexity. He had learned that friendship worth having was friendship that could survive truth-telling, and that mercy was not just a gift to the forgiven, but a blessing to the forgiver. As the months and years passed, their story became part of village wisdom, told and retold, to teach children about the dangers of envy and the power of redemption. But it was told not as a simple morality tale, with clear heroes and villains, but as a complex story about the way good people could make terrible choices and still find their way back to goodness. In the village of Umueze, where the red earth was rich enough to grow second chances as well as yams, two families continued to live side by side, their fences serving not as barriers, but as reminders that true security came not from having more than others, but from being part of a community where everyone's well-being mattered. And when the rains came each season, and the earth blessed their honest labor with abundance, both men remembered the lesson that had cost so much to learn, that the sweetest harvest is not the one you steal from others, but the one you share with neighbors whose friendship has survived the test of truth. The end. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. The bitter harvest reminds us that even in our darkest mistakes, truth and forgiveness still hold the power to heal. To make sure you don't miss more emotional and meaningful stories like this, subscribe to Queen of Afritales. And if this tale touched your heart, please leave a like to support us. And so the village learned that envy is a seed that grows into thorns, choking out everything good in the heart where it takes root. But they also learned that truth, though painful, is the only soil in which real friendship can flourish, and that forgiveness, though costly, is the rain that helps wounded relationships bloom again. From that day forward, whenever someone in Umueze felt the bitter stirring of jealousy toward a neighbor's success, the elders would tell them the story of Emeka and Akachi, reminding them that the richest harvest any person can have is the knowledge that their prosperity lifts up their community rather than tearing it down. This is how it came to be that in Umueze, abundance became something to be shared rather than hoarded, success became something to be celebrated rather than envied, and friendship became strong enough to survive even the worst mistakes, because they had learned that healing was always possible when people chose truth over deception and mercy over revenge.